Good evening. My name is Rachel Hammer, and I'm the Chief Development Officer here at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And I'm so excited to welcome everyone to this evening's events. Fitz-Greene Halleck, the most famous gay poet you never heard of. Since the pandemic, we have had the opportunity to create new ways of connecting with our learning community. And I am thrilled that we have so many new people here tonight and those who already know us. For those of you who don't know, the Library Company is one of the oldest cultural institutions in the country and the first Library of Congress. We were created in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin. Our collections were used when creating the founding documents of the United States, and our books and shareholders were present during the First and Second Continental Congresses. The Library Company is a library with an original mission to put books in the hands of ordinary citizens. It is a library with a vision that inspires us to better ourselves so we can better the greater community. And it is a library that is woven into the fabric of American democracy. Today, almost 300 years later, the Library Company is no longer a circulating library, rather a research library that makes our historic collections available to scholars, educators, and the general public. To know that anyone can come into the Library Company, visit with one of our librarians or curators, read and study a draft of the Constitution, review early political cartoons, handwritten notes from Frederick Douglass, and others who were not only significant yesterday, but certainly today, is an amazing testament to the strength of our institution, but also the strength of our learning community, all of you here today. With a mission to grasp a better understanding of early American history, with all of its challenges and opportunities to learn from, it is with great excitement that we welcome you all here tonight. I hope that you'll enjoy our program and that you'll come back again and again. Even more so, I hope that you'll consider becoming part of this amazing learning community, a place where we can grow and learn together and make our community the best place possible for everyone. If you're interested in membership, please check out our website or reach out to our development staff. Now, tonight's program holds a special place in the hearts of so many people here. It's a program that's been part of a greater initiative that started in 2014, 7 years ago, with an exhibition and array of programs called That's So Gay, Outing Early America. That was one of our first initiatives that explored gay history and the lives, stories, and identities of people who would be considered lesbian, gay, bi, trans, or queer today. And over the last 7 years, we have continued the work of recovering and sharing LGBTQ history. However, in 2018, we created a special society to support our work, the Charlotte Cushman Society. And each year, we look for contributions so we can have more programs like this. And I envision a greater role for Charlotte Cushman over the years to come, one where we can come together and talk about programs and events and really create wonderful opportunities, additional opportunities like this. As a giving society interested community members, we recover and reveal these important stories hidden in our archives and share them not only with our members, but with everyone who's interested. And I'll just say that if each one of us could help us here tonight just by providing a small gift to Charlotte Cushman. Your gift is 100% tax deductible, but that would help us reveal so many more stories, so many of us could grasp a better understanding of our past. If you're interested, you can visit our website or you can reach out to our development department at development@librarycompany.org. But enough of that. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker this evening, Dr. Don James McLaughlin, who will be introducing our speaker, Dr. Jordan Alexander Stein. Dr. McLaughlin is the assistant professor of 19th century American literature at the University of Tulsa. He first became part of the Library Company community in 2013 while collaborating with Connie King, our curator of women's history and chief of reference on the That's So Gay exhibition, Outing Early America. I would just like to say a short thank you to Connie for her passion and commitment to our scholarship, to our programming, and to the Library Company. Connie, we are so lucky to have you. Finally, some Zoom housekeeping issues. If many of you will notice that there's closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to turn it on or off, it's at the bottom bar on my screen. It's all the way to the right. It's in a box with 2 little C's in it. And it says, mine says live transcript underneath. But if you click on that box, there should be a label beneath the transcript that drops down, and you can select to hide the subtitles and to either remove or add the closed captioning. And so without further ado, I would ask John James to take the stage.
Thank you, Rachel. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Don James, and I'm tuning in from Tulsa tonight. I was in the middle of getting my PhD in Philly when I first had the opportunity to meet Connie. Building a friendship with Connie at the library company and collaborating together on the exhibit That's So Gay several years ago was one of the greatest privileges of that time and of my career in general. It's also one of those gifts that has kept on multiplying over time. Tonight, I'm pleased to have the chance to introduce Dr. Jordan Alexander Stein, professor of English at Fordham University, a scholar I've respected for quite a while, whose work continues to challenge and inspire me in unexpected ways. I don't think Jordan and I have officially met in person, but I was remembering, I mean, we have, but I don't think we've talked at length, because the time we met, I passed Jordan as a PhD student in Manhattan, and I recognized him, and I just said hi very awkwardly, and then kept walking. And then later, we connected over that, and he was very gracious about my awkwardness. And so I hope there will be more opportunities for in-person conversation in the future. Professor Stein's scope of expertise is vast. I first encountered his scholarship through the wonderful collection Early African-American Print Culture that he co-edited with Lara Cohen. At in-person conferences, I became acquainted with his playful but also profound contributions to critical theory, an area of strength I think best displayed in his 2019 contribution on the topic of theory to the NYU Press series Avidly Reads. If you've read Professor Stein's recently published monograph, When Novels Were Books, from Harvard Press in 2020, you know that he is also one of the most respected contemporary scholars of book history and the material origins of the novel. Speaking to this latter association in preparation for this evening, I stumbled across my friend and colleague Sonia Hazard's review of When Novels Were Books. And it was enjoyable for me to see someone not trained in literary history, whom I respect as much as Dr. Hazard, use phrases like admirable historical spade work and hard won and exciting to celebrate the history of the novel that Professor Stein offers. One of my favorite things about Professor Stein's work is the way he achieves an unmistakable voice that feels both friendly and rigorous in challenging what we think we know about literature, a tone both disarming in its familiarity and persistent in its pursuit of the neglected and underexamined. In concluding this introduction tonight, I want to read a short passage from his 2019 book on theory that captures this aspect of Professor Stein's style in a consideration of the earliest flickers of what we now know by the name queer theory. In reflecting on the potential that theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick located in the word queer as a capacious concept denoting states of deviance and variation, he writes, homosexuality, in which the gender of one's preferred sexual object is not normatively optimized with other components of identity, was for her just one of many complications. An intriguing consequence of this scheme was that a person might have a gender and a preferred sexual object that all lined up with her or his biological sex, while nonetheless maintaining a fantasy life that veered elsewhere. That possibility was a queerness, just as much as any more observable social behavior, like homoerotic sex or gender nonconformity. He goes on, the excitement of such a possibility had to do with the implication that queerness wasn't just a matter of sexual identity in the usual sense. Gender transitivity could happen at the level of fantasy, and fantasies could get acted out or not. Queer theory in this vein did a lot to validate the possibility that you might desire the idea of something you didn't actually want to do, or that you might identify with people who were not in some observable ways like you. Queer theory dignified the prospect that you could see yourself as someone at variance from what other people see about you. At the same time, those possibilities didn't make you a particular kind of person, not an X or a type or kind, unless perhaps you wanted to be. Queer held open the space of something astonishingly variable and open-ended. All you had to be was yourself, in all of your myriad social, psychological, and performative complexity. I wanted to read that passage at length because it's one of my favorite passages in this book, and I thought would set the mood for tonight in a pretty wonderful way. For me, this elegant meditation on the word queer provides insight into an admirable ethic at the heart of Professor Stein's writing. The unmistakable voice I talked about earlier is a manifestation, I think, of his commitment to you, his reader, to welcome you as you are in all of your social, psychological, and performative complexity when you encounter his words. It's an honor to get to introduce him for tonight's talk, Fitz-Greene Halleck, the most famous gay poet you've never heard of. Please join me in welcoming this year's Charlotte Cushman Society speaker, Dr. Jordan Alexander Stein.
Don James, thank you so much. That was so lovely, and I'm actually without words, but it's hard to make me without words. So thank you for doing that. I'd like to begin by joining the chorus of folks who are thanking Connie King. She's the one who invited me to give this lecture. She's also the person who came up with a pretty terrific title that captions it. In a different, better world, we would all be at the Library Company in Philadelphia tonight. It's one of my favorite places to be and one of my favorite places to work. But it is great that we're able to assemble in this way. I'm something of a Fitz-Greene Halleck hobbyist. I'm not the most obvious person to give a talk about him, except that I do talk a lot about him. But I'd like to therefore begin by acknowledging some of the scholars of 19th century poetry and of Halleck in particular, who have left a really impressive trail of breadcrumbs that I was able to follow through the archives. So I'd just like to signal out the work here of Meredith McGill, Virginia Jackson, Ben Friedlander, Don James McLaughlin, and John W.M. Halleck, who I don't know personally, but who wrote a critical biography of Fitz-Greene Halleck called The American Byron in 2000, from which I have learned a lot. So thank you all for making what I'm about to say possible. The assumption that I wrote this under was that most people will not have heard of Fitz-Greene Halleck or not know much about him. So the kind of plan for the next 45 minutes is to introduce you to him and some of his poetry, to identify some of the people he knew and who knew him, to focus on some of the ways he's been remembered, and then at the conclusion to think about some of the ways that circumstantial evidence is important evidence as we try to tell gay history. So if you're just here for circumstantial evidence, you're going to have to hang out to the end. The place to begin this discussion is actually in Central Park in New York. Get my slides to work. There we go. This is Poets Walk in Central Park in Manhattan. It's one of the kind of iconic locations in Central Park. It's a very straight path, about 40 feet wide and half a mile long, lined with these beautiful elm trees and lampposts. There are 4 statues that line Poets Walk, 3 of whom represent individuals or the poets for whom it's named. One is Robert Burns, one is Walter Scott, and the third is Fitz-Greene Halleck. Halleck, yes, there's a statue. This was unveiled in 1877. Halleck had died 10 years before in 1867, but in terms of sculpturing, this was put up basically immediately. It was envisioned in 1871, almost immediately after Halleck's death. And here is, we would sort of think of the kind of corporate body that formed to put up the statue. We would think of it as like a nonprofit today, but it was in any case a group of wealthy New Yorkers who were interested to make sure they could memorialize their friend. This is cut off. The list is longer, it goes for several more inches, but what I wanted to kind of draw your attention to is the list of names includes important cultural figures like Samuel F. Morse and William Cullen Bryant, but also just some of the wealthiest society families of New York of the 1870s, the Tiffanys, the Morgans, the Macy's. This was the creation of the Fitz-Greene Halleck statue was a major kind of social event. It was unveiled in New York in 1877 by none other than Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th president of the United States, the Ohio Republican who had just taken office earlier that year. So many people gathered in Central Park to witness the statue, and you can see Hayes is there on the left, kind of holding the rope that pulls off the drape. Just on the bottom, kind of in the foreground of the image, you see these two women kind of looking at each other and swooning. So many people reportedly turned up to see the unveiling of the statue. It was about 10,000 people. In 1877, the population of New York City was just under 1 million. Today, it's about 8.5 million. So if proportional to the population, this would be like 85,000 people showing up for something, which is just quite a lot. But in any case, the 10,000 people who did show up to see Halleck did so much damage to the park that an ordinance was put in place that prohibited large gatherings. That ordinance remained in place until the 1960s. So there was a kind of enduring impact of this event in the social life of New York City. Halleck sounds like an important guy. So who was he? Well, Halleck was born in 1790 and died in 1867, in both cases in Guilford, Connecticut, which is a town on the kind of southern coast of Connecticut, just east of New Haven. He came to New York for the first time at the age of 18 in the year 1808, and he liked it so much he decided to come back and stay. He lived in New York for about 40 years, mostly as a bachelor in Greenwich Village. For a period of about 10 years between 1832 and 1842, he worked and was kind of a right-hand man for John Jacob Astor, the wealthy New York millionaire and socialite. It was in his 20s and early 30s that Halleck really shined. Not long after he came to New York, he served in the War of 1812, and he found particular popularity in that decade, due largely to his association with other famous men, and especially the kind of circles, the literary circles that were moving around Washington Irving in New York at the time. Halleck's earliest public notoriety came from collaboration with this guy here. This guy here, Joseph Rodman Drake. They collaborated on a series of poems that were known as the Croaker poems. These were anonymously published, but people knew it was them. They were largely satirical, kind of talk of the town, kind of in that way that New Yorkers love to hear stories about other New Yorkers. These poems were published in New York newspapers and were fairly widely popular. What I can show you in this image, this is just what a Croaker poem looked like as a kind of newspaper column. But if we sort of zoom in here, you can see to E. Simpson Esquire on witnessing the representation of the new tragedy of Brutus. So this is about a play that's just in theaters, and it begins, "I have been every night, whether empty or crowded, and taken my seat in your box number 3. In a sort of poetical Scotch mist I'm shrouded, as the far-famed invisible girl used to be." So, this is again like a kind of vignette that's very much about the theater that other people are going to at the same time. And it's this kind of talk of the town quality that makes these poems particularly notable. You can also see here at the bottom, that it's signed Croaker Jr. Croaker Jr. was Halleck, Croaker was Drake, and when they were sometimes signed Croaker and Company, that was usually a collaboration between them. But to go back to Drake, it was the Croaker poems and then this collaboration that really cemented Halleck's poetic interest. It also established the basis for what was clearly a very emotionally intense friendship between the two men. It's possible that they were lovers, although it's not 100% certain whether Halleck's desires for Drake were reciprocated or consummated. But you can imagine that Halleck was strongly disapproving when Drake fairly suddenly married in 1816, and Halleck was very strongly bereft when Drake almost equally as suddenly died in 1820. This is a little bit of a sidebar here, but Drake is buried. He was buried in a small plot that was kind of well outside the 19th century city of New York, but now is in the Bronx and Hunts Point. And it was a little cemetery that was in 1915, as the Bronx was getting developed, it was kind of enclosed, and it became a park that was named in 1915, Joseph Rodman Drake Park. about 100 years later in our century, it was determined that this land, which had been a cemetery prior, was an African burial ground. And so the New York City, in 2013, the New York City Parks Department officially renamed the park the Joseph Rodman Drake Park and Enslaved African Burial Ground. In any case, sidebar over, Halleck went on to publish poetry for the rest of his life. And his most important and enduring work was done in the 1820s, kind of on the energy that the collaboration with Drake helped to create. One such poem, which I'll read to you in order to give you a sense of Halleck's own poetic practice, is an elegy for Drake. And so this just begins here on the death of Joseph Rodman Drake of New York, September 1820. Green be the turf above thee, friend of my better days. None knew thee but to love thee, nor named thee but to praise. Tears fell when thou wert dying, from eyes unused to weep, and long where thou art lying, will tears the cold turf steep. When hearts whose truth was proven, like thine are laid in earth, there should a wreath be woven to tell the world their worth. And I who woke each morrow to clasp thy hand in mine, who shared thy joy and sorrow, whose weal and woe were thine. It should be mine to braid it around thy faded brow, but I've in vain essayed it, and feel I cannot now. While memory bids me weep thee, nor thoughts nor words are free, the grief is fixed too deeply that mourns a man like thee. You can gather from this verse, again, some of the intensity of this relationship, I think, comes across, but there are also, at a more formal register, just a number of elements that are characteristic of Halleck's poems. What you have here, right, are a series of quatrain or four-line stanzas, a fairly regular metrical structure, a kind of A-B rhyme. The meter is what's actually called a trochaic heptameter, which just simply means that it's 7 syllables per line, but beginning and ending with a stressed syllable. The classic use of a trochee, which again is stressed, unstressed. The classic use of a trochee is what's called a tetrameter, which is 8 syllables. So the fact that this is 7 suggests that something is short, cut off, abrupt. You can see, and especially on the top of page 30 there in that stanza, you can see there's a lot of consonants, like these W's: who woke, who shared, whose weal and woe were. Like these internal rhymes, and they're not exactly rhymes, but these internal repeated sounds create some of the music of this poetry. The final stanza, you'll see the way it's not A-B anymore. It's thee, free, deeply, thee. These are effectively 2 pairs of couplets, and a couplet, right, is just 2 lines that rhyme with each other, one after the other. But couplets here are suggesting something about things that belong together, I think. So in other words, on the one hand, the poem itself is expressing something very emotional, a lot of longing and sadness, but at the same time, formally, metrically, there's a number of things that are doing the work to reinforce the message. What I'm trying to, the other thing I should tell you is that is the prosody, which is just worth noting, because what Halleck does here, almost every word in this poem is 1 syllable, and some are 2. Nothing is more than 2. And this, I think, also gives just language a clarity, a coherence, a unity. There's nothing, again, at the level of sound, there's a simplicity. Elsewhere, he plays around with prosody, and he sometimes, he'll tag a number of syllables to different parts of speech, so that, for example, in the poem Marco Bozzaris, adjectives are frequently 3 syllables and verbs are frequently 2. And so, which produces a kind of repetition, which adds to that kind of internal resonance, which makes the language, I think, a little bit more beautiful. It also means that moments that deviate from this pattern, not unlike the couplet that you get at the end of this poem, they add a subtle emphasis. And all I'm trying to suggest here is that as a poet, Halleck really knew what he was doing. He was very studied and very accomplished in the kinds of classical form that were popular in this period. The list, this is a selected list of his works. It's actually selected in part by what's in the library company's collection. But you can see just from some of these dates that his productivity seems to cluster kind of before 1840. He's doing a lot in the 20s and 30s. He's still writing in the 1840s and after, but less. And the poetical writings of Fitz-Greene Halleck, the 1847 book that's listed there, is a collection, an anthology of his writings, and he is starting to be more and more anthologized in that decade. So there's a way in which he has a kind of strong start. And then for a variety of different reasons, productivity ebbs and flows after that. The second item that's listed there as author, Alnwick Castle and Other Poems, 1827, you can see this is a first edition here. You can see that Halleck's name is not on the title page. It was published anonymously, but as with the Croaker poems, everybody knew who it was.
Jordan, just really quickly, there's some occasional feedback in the microphone from, I think, the page turning, just so you know.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I will endeavor to stop fidgeting. The poem about Joseph Rodman Drake is in this collection, as is another poem called Marco Bozzaris, which is Halleck's most famous poem. The illustration there is from a later edition. I think it's an 1846 edition. Marco Bozzaris was composed around 1825. It tells the story of a Christian general who fought in the Greek War for Independence against the Ottoman Empire. Bozzaris was Halleck's own contemporary. So Halleck was born in 1790. Bozzaris was born in 1788. He dies in 1823, just shortly after Drake dies. The decision to write a poem about Marco Bozzaris, among other things, I think shows the enduring influence of Byron on Halleck, because Byron, although was older than both men, himself died in 1824 from an infection from sepsis, but he was on his way to Greece to assist the army in its military struggle. And he did a lot to kind of valorize and romanticize the cause there for independence. So that Halleck is writing poems about a hero of this battle is, I think, again, partially the influence of Byron. Let me just draw your attention to the last stanza of this poem. Nope, here it is. Down at the bottom, talk of thy doom without a sigh, for thou art freedom's now and fame's, one of the few, the immortal names that were not born to die. This poem is about sacrifice to a higher purpose, a poem about the immortality that comes with this kind of work. And there's a sort of beautiful irony by which a poem that's about this kind of immortality through fame becomes Halleck's own bid for it. When Halleck dies in 1867, this is his New York Times obituary, and part of how he's remembered, you can see in the quote that I pulled out, is For Marco Bozzaris, a poem widely known and universally admired as one of the finest martial poems in the language. This is 1867 at the end of Halleck's life, but 60 years later in the same publication, the New York Times, a biography of Halleck comes out in 1930, and it's reviewed, and you can see just from the headline, a Knickerbocker wit and poet, Fitz-Greene Halleck, whose Marco Bozzaris every American schoolboy used to know. So this is the poem that makes him famous. It was, however, also famous in his lifetime. And this is a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote, where he writes to a man named James Wilson. We'll hear more about him in a minute. But he says, Abraham Lincoln really enjoyed reading Marco Bozzaris. Perhaps more consequentially, in 1872, a reference shows up in a letter written by Emily Dickinson here at the bottom. This is just to friends Louise and Francis Norcross, 1872. Back here, sorry, arrow. Dickinson writes at the bottom, "We conquered, but Bozzaris fell. That sentence always chokes me." And Dickinson often signed off her letters by evoking a mood rather than a salutation. What all this begins to suggest is that in his own time, Halleck was known as a pretty major literary figure. This image, this is Christian Schussely's Washington Irving and His Literary Friends, 1864. Halleck dies in 67, so this is toward the end of his life. But this painting is a little bit of a literary who's who of the mid-19th century. And you can see on the left, there's a kind of cluster of 5 men. Halleck is is lower of the two that's facing the left, but the man above him is Nathaniel Hawthorne. The man next to him is Longfellow, right? This is the crowd in which he was esteemed. After Halleck's death, he seems to represent not just a kind of prestigious poet or an accomplished figure, but somebody who represents old New York in the kind of best and most optimistic sense. And it's in this way that Halleck shows up briefly in Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence. This novel was published in 1920, but it's set in the 1870s. And Mrs. Archer, who's already, a mature woman in the 1870s, she's recalling, the cultivated literary society, how things used to be better when we had Washington Irving, Fitz-Greene Halleck, and the poet of the culprit Fay. A similar sense shows up the same year in 1920 in Little Old New York, a play by Rita Johnson Young. Rita Johnson Young was a really important Broadway playwright, wrote a number of songs, hit plays. Little Old New York ran for 308 performances in 1920 and 21. It was adapted into a film in 1923 starring Marion Davies, who was a very significant silent film actor. She was also, you may know her name, she was also the mistress of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul. Halleck is a minor character in both the play and the film. He was played in the film by a man named Norval Keedwell. I could find nothing on Keedwell. He seems to have been one of those actors who had work in the silent era, but when sound comes in, doesn't work again. I did find an obituary that suggested he lived until 1980, but it was a little vague on what he did between about 1927 and 1980. So I don't know if he had a day job or what he looks like. But in any case, Halleck is part of this, kind of looking backward to New York. The last example I'll give you is the dedication of the Lincoln Tunnel in 1937. Lincoln Tunnel obviously connects 42nd Street in Manhattan with Weehawken, New Jersey. And when it opened, there was fanfare, and there was a Fitz-Greene Halleck poem about Weehawken that was reprinted on the pamphlet. This is courtesy of the Hoboken Historical Museum. You may be saying, well, there aren't a lot of poems about Weehawken. Of course, Fitz-Greene Halleck, was used here. But I would also say that for this kind of public event, this kind of a dedication, the poem or the poet who would be evoked would be someone not controversial, not avant-garde, right? Somebody who represents a kind of standard. And I think in addition to the subject, Weehawken, Halleck's reputation allowed him to be present in this way. Part of the enduring knowledge of Halleck into the 20th century owes to the fanfare that was made at the time of his death in 1867, not only the statue in Central Park, but also the more portable monuments that were edited by James Grant Wilson, the guy who sent Abraham Lincoln a copy of Halleck's book. Wilson in 1869, so just 2 years after Halleck's death, put out two editions. Here we go. The Poetical Writings of Fitz-Greene Halleck and the Life and Letters of Fitz-Greene Halleck. And this was, Wilson was a very prolific editor, and he would frequently do this. He would edit somebody's works and put out multiple volumes that weren't meant to be like in sequence. So this is not unusual that he would do these two things, but it's through these volumes of letters, the letters in particular, that modern readers have learned a lot. I'm going to read that sentence one more time. I apologize. It's through the volume of letters in particular that modern readers have learned that not all of Halleck's poems were about things like immortality. The one of the poems that's reproduced here that's not published anywhere else that's worth talking about, and I want to read to you at length, is an early poem dated March 1809. So Halleck visited New York for the first time as a young man in 1808. He goes back to Connecticut to gather his affairs before he moves to the city. In that summer, he encounters a man named Carlos Mina, who was from Cuba, who had been sent to Guilford, Connecticut to learn English by his father. And the two young men, you can see where the arrow is pointing, the two young men were intimate during the handsome young Cuban's residence for upward of a year in Guilford. I don't know a lot about Carlos Mina. The last name Mina doesn't seem to me to be, Carlos obviously is a Spanish name, but Mina seems German. So the family may have immigrated to Cuba at a certain point and then and then been part of the kind of increasingly kind of global north, the hemispheric kind of trade routes. I don't know exactly who he was, but what I can tell you is that it seems that Halleck really liked him. And if we read this poem, we'll see this goes on for a couple of pages, but you can follow along. Though stormy billows roll between and raging winds unite, and leagues of ocean intervene to hide you from my sight, though days and months have rolled away and many a circling year since that lamented mournful day that caused the parting tear, yet still by fond remembrance taught, your pleasing form I view. Sorry, can I get the page? No, here. And in my hours of lonely thought, I muse and think of you. Time whose destroying, wasting hand bears all before its sway, and marks imprinted on the sand the ocean sweeps away. Yet hath its circuit rolled in vain, your memory to efface, still every feature I retain and every gesture trace. Oft in the stillness of the night, when slumbers close mine eyes, your image bursts upon my sight, I gaze in glad surprise. And oft when evening's mantle gray is o'er the valley spread, with pensive steps I musing stray by roving fancy led. Her wild romantic flights unfold, events in former days, and scenes on memory's page unrolled, her backward glance surveys. When by youth's cheering smiles caressed, we pass the social hours, when calm enjoyment sportive dressed life's opening path with flowers. And say, my friend, does memory bring these pleasures to your heart? Can thoughts which from remembrance spring a rapturous charm impart? Ah, yes, that gentle heart I know, at friendship's touch it beats. I feel the sympathetic glow, my breast the throb repeats. Then let us cherish well the flame of friendship and of love. Let peaceful virtue be our aim, our hopes be placed above. There in affliction may we find a refuge ever nigh. May time our friendly union bind and years cement the tie. Wherever on life's varied stage a devious maze you go, whether where winter's tempests rage or summer's breezes blow, yet in your hours of solitude, when the calm mind is free, let the remembrance oft intrude of friendship and of me. Secure along life's winding stream, calm may your moments glide, and may the almighty power supreme your wavering footsteps guide. May he preserve you free from woe through time's few fleeting years, and never-ending bliss bestow beyond the veil of tears. Carlos, adieu, within my heart your memory firm shall dwell, till pierced by death's unerring dart, I bid the world farewell. The imagery and the diction of this poem are notable in their exuberance. References to Carlos' pleasing form, to him thinking during lonely hours, to romantic flights, cheering smiles caressed, friendship's touch, throbbing breasts, memory firm until pierced by an unerring dart. There's a lot of sensual language here. The poem doesn't have many critics. Not a lot of people have read this or certainly commented on it, but those who have, including Robert K. Martin and John W.M. Halleck, have both suggested that what's being implied here is a scene of masturbation, a fantasy of the beloved who isn't present, a gay love poem that either records or projects an intimacy or both between Halleck and Mina. The poem is effusive in a way that 19th century poetry could sometimes be, but usually was not. And if the editor James Grant Wilson is correct, this happens to be the only surviving one of 18 such poems that Halleck sent that summer. This is an extra textual detail, but it cannot easily be explained by convention or genre. Like, that seems a little forward, to say the least. So the question we may be wondering now is, was Fitz-Greene Halleck gay? Well, it's a hard thing to prove, and I'm not exactly sure how we would prove it. He never called himself gay. But he also never married. He wrote poems that express, as we've seen, that express deep love, real longing, and intense desire for other men. Perhaps most interestingly, Halleck also shows up at the scene of some early forms of queer subcultures, such as were emerging in New York City in the 19th century. And I want to pause and talk about these for a minute. We don't know a huge amount about this subculture, but what we do know is that before the Civil War, in New York City, there were nearly zero arrests or legal infractions, such as we would generally classify under sodomy laws. These were actually kind of struck from the books early in the century, and there were no prosecutions. And this changes at the end of the century. There was a lot of concern about morality, and I happen to just love this image. This is from what do you call it? A moral reform directory is what it's called, published in 1839 in New York City. You can see from the title page, prostitution exposed, laying bare the lives, histories, residence, seductions, etc. of the most celebrated courtesans and ladies of pleasure of the city of New York. This is meant to be something that exposes prostitution as it promises, but it also, if you read it, gives you the addresses of where houses of assignation and brothels are. So it clearly could have more than one use. It is, however, an artifact of a culture as early as 1839 that is prosecuting prostitution, that is up in arms about vice, that is making laws about women's independent sexual conduct, that is raiding printers and sellers of pornography. But all of this is heterosexual. Any non-heterosexual cultures that exist aren't under scrutiny in the same ways, which is an interesting thing. We might say that sexual cultures in New York City, in the antebellum period, apart from domestic and conjugal heterosexuality, are becoming visible, but they're also becoming regulated. One way that they become visible is through vice districts. And this is George Caitlin's painting of the 5 Points intersection. It was 1827. 5 Points was the kind of notorious vice district of Lower Manhattan. And you can see from this scene, it's a kind of chaotic street scene. The streets aren't straight, the buildings are crooked. People are drinking, carousing, fighting. There's interracial social mingling going on. Animals are running around, groceries are spilling. It's a chaotic scene. This is a map, 1842 map of Lower Manhattan, and I just want to try to help orient you here. The 5 Points is down here. It's not just in that one point, it's a number of blocks, but it's down here by City Hall, also called Park Row, which is also where a lot of the printers are. Fitz-Greene Halleck lives up here on Greenwich Lane in Greenwich Village, and you can see from this map that the kind of gray shaded areas are where there are buildings, and above that, there are these white squares, and that suggests lots and streets that are apportioned, but there aren't buildings there yet. So we might say that Halleck literally lives at the opposite end of the city from the vice districts that are emerging. However, in the 1830s, he works here at the Astor Library, a little bit further downtown. When I mentioned a minute ago that same-sex sexual relations weren't really prosecuted in New York, this starts to change after the Civil War in the 1870s, and the area that becomes targeted is this area on the Bowery here. It seems to be, if you were in New York in the 1870s and wanted a male prostitute, it was more or less where you went. And then the other location here, this is Pfaff's underground bar, and I'll talk about Pfaff's in a minute. But what I want to suggest is that it would seem on the one hand that Halleck is living kind of at the opposite end of town from the kind of public places where people would encounter sexual cultures, but they come to him. There's a closeness to all this. To walk from Greenwich Village to City Hall even today is not, it's not such a hard thing to do. Same-sex sexual cultures presumably exist in this period, but they have only very limited visibility. Some of that visibility is negative. And the example that I would share with you, and this is short-lived sort of satirical kind of gentleman's newspaper called The Whip. It came out on Saturdays for a couple of years. This is March 1842. And you see this woodcut image on the front page of females in masquerade. That doesn't mean women who are dressed up. It means men who are dressed up as women. We would now call female impersonators. Right? And it's in this context to kind of warn you of this terrible thing that's going on, but it's also creating visibility. Earlier the same year, in January of 1842, a different issue of The Whip had a story about sodomites, and you can just sort of see it here, the sodomites. And it's all written in a kind of hand-wringing, like, isn't this terrible kind of way. And so down here you get this description, our city within the vicinity of the park, and they mean Park Row down by City Hall near the Vice District, will become a second Palais Royal. And the Palais Royal was a kind of famed part of Paris where one could find non-standard sexual pleasures for hire, including same-sex prostitutes. So this is an interesting sentence. It's kind of warning that our city in the vicinity of the Vice District could become a gay neighborhood. So, you know, we can think about whether that's tongue-in-cheek or what the audience is, or how, like, maybe structurally homophobic this all is. But in any case, these kind of innuendos and codes are part of the way that queer subcultures become visible in this period in the 1840s. They're still difficult to locate in the historical record, especially when those records are incomplete and fragmentary. Another reason they can be difficult to locate is because terminology gets a little bit tricky. I mentioned before Pfaff's pub underground. Pfaff's was, I mean, it was literally underground in the way that sometimes like bars in New York still are, or in Philadelphia too, like in the basement, you have to walk down a flight of stairs from the street to go into a kind of underground spot. But Pfaff's was kind of famously home to people who called themselves Bohemians. Walt Whitman was a regular there, and it's through Whitman's association that we know a bit about it. But it also, there are records, instances of, you know, somebody was a female impersonator, or other celebrities associated with sex or what seems like emergent queer cultures are kind of hovering around Pfaff's. It seems like a hub of a kind. In retrospect, in the 1880s, there's a write-up. You see this is Brooklyn Daily Eagle, 1884. There's a write-up about Bohemianism in the city, and it mentions, you see where the arrow is there at the bottom. This is what it looks like. It mentions different writers who went to Pfaff's, and the last one, 3 lines from the bottom, the last one is Fitz-Greene Halleck. The latter poet dropped in occasionally and had a chat with the young fellows, sipping a whiskey punch, which he liked made very hot. I'm not quite sure who's being quoted there. The appearance of, so I guess I don't know how to prove that Fitz-Greene Halleck was gay, but I can show you that he does seem to show up or live in proximity to different aspects of New York's emergent queer sexual culture. These places, there's 2 things to take note of. One is his age. So Halleck was born in 1790. Whitman was born in 1819. So in the 1840s, Whitman was coming out of his 20s and Halleck was entering his 50s. So the sense that he was an older man who dropped in and talked with the young fellows suggests something about why some of these queer spaces that we do have records of may not have been as accessible to him, because when we don't have records for the things that may or may not have existed when Halleck was a young man. The other difficulty here is the kind of codes and terminology that structure these whole things. Bohemianism is not a 19th century term that specifically means gay or queer, but it doesn't not mean that. It seems to be one of the many things that it can mean, or at least be associated with. The appearance of codes and innuendo are a well-known feature of gay life in the 20th century. The closets we come out of, the surreptitious public life we come out to. How to read these codes in the historical record can be challenging, but what I can tell you is whether or not precisely Halleck was himself gay or would have recognized that description. Latter-day remembrances of Halleck often seem to be in some of this coded language. One example is Bayard Taylor's 1870 novel, Joseph and His Friend, A Story of Pennsylvania, which is a story of 2 very overly close men who are working out their relationship to each other and with no kind of female love interests in sight. This is sometimes thought in the 20th century to be, one of the first gay novels written in America. Friend, like Bohemian, is one of these words that has a number of connotations. It doesn't specifically mean homosexual, but it doesn't not mean that, at least depends on the context. So Joseph and his friend is an interesting way to title the story. The clearest, queerest testament to what we might now call Halleck's coded gayness, however, may be hiding in plain sight. And I'm referring to this statue and sort of specifically its deeply weird pose. In order to understand what's going on here, I need to tell you just a little bit about bronze statues, which bronze is a classical medium for statues, but bronze doesn't get used in the United States until the 1840s. The first foundry is established in Brooklyn, New York, by Henry Kirk Brown, and this is an example of his work. He's sort of the father of American bronze statuary in the 19th century. He was very interested in naturalistic styles, though sometimes with neoclassical elements. Bronze statuary kind of stops in the 1860s during the Civil War and then comes hugely into fashion afterward. So that a statue that's created in the 1870s would be such as Halleck's would be cast in bronze is exactly in fashion, very, very key to the moment. Bronze sculpture after the Civil War enters into this kind of golden age, if you'll accept the pun, including artists like Augustus St. Gaudens, Frederick Remington, and Abbess Stebbins, the latter of whom cast this statue, the Angel of the Waters, which is on top of Bethesda Fountain in Central Park. Bethesda Fountain is kind of at the northern terminus of the Poet's Walk, where Halleck's statue resides. This was installed in 1873, and Halleck's statue was installed in 1877, just 4 years later. The artistic challenge of bronze sculpture is to create a sense of movement. Bronze obviously is very stiff, so you want to make it seem as fluid and lifelike as possible. Depending on the subject, that may be graceful, as the example we saw with Kirk, or it may be dramatic. Sorry, the slide's not working. No. Here, Frederick Remington, The Mountain Man, 1903 later, but this is a good example of the kind of dramatic energy that bronze sculpture tries to capture. If part of what sculpture is trying to do is to try to figure out how to represent motion, then Halleck's statue is almost swishy in the way it's sitting. It seems to be capturing something about the man, his personality, his way of carrying himself through the world. You may think I'm overreading here a little bit, but a similar, though less celebratory, coded take appeared in the New York Times in 1980 in an article about Central Park statues that took notice of Halleck. And I'm just going to point to this paragraph here, which talks about it's surveying all the statues and trying to say, like, you may not know what this is from, but let me tell you who it is. And it describes Halleck with his teacup fingers, pursed lips, and negligently strewn books that suggest a literary prig, but the now forgotten part-time poet was best known in his day for a satire on social climbers. There's a certain amount of, I think, disdain in that description, but I don't think it's that hard to find also a coded homophobia that may be a recognition of a kind of coded effeminate, if not strictly homosexual potential. What I'm suggesting here is that the presence of code or innuendo, the hiding in plain sight, the refusal to leave an unequivocal trace or to declare that we were here and queer, that those indirections are themselves the evidence of gay history and should be treated accordingly. So to wrap up, what I can tell you with absolute certainty, and this was told to me by my dear friend Mark Horn, a lifelong New Yorker who spent his early adulthood in New York City in the 1970s, as part of the early gay liberation movement. It was once custom among New York City's homosexuals to visit Halleck's statue in Central Park on July 8th, Halleck's birthday, and leave flowers in the open hand of the statue. And you can see the ones that I left a couple of years ago. There aren't a lot of statues of avowed swishy queer poets. Such statues are in fact pretty hard to come by, and sucker for history that I am, I try now to go every year on July 8th and leave flowers. And it's my hope that maybe this summer I'll see you there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was wonderful. As we mentioned at the beginning, we have a Q&A box that you can use to ask questions if you have them, and I will keep my eye on that box and pay attention to that. But I also have a question myself. I've been working on Fitz-Greene Halleck over the last year, and it's pretty wild that I think Halleck is actually having kind of a moment right now. And also, you know, the surprise of Halleck having a moment resonates with your talk in really important ways. I was thinking about your argument in dialogue with Nat Hurley's book, Circulating Queerness, which argues that modern sexuality, the language of identity and orientation, can be understood to cohere partly through communities of readers. And she thinks about the way books that maybe aren't explicitly queer in their moment become associated with queer orientations through those readers and become kind of revered objects and are infused with a kind of certain affective coherence that was belated. So she's thinking about Melville, she's thinking about Jewett and other New England regionalists, and it's a really persuasive argument. But I was thinking how Halleck is interesting as someone who might have been his books might have been such objects of reverence. And at times they do kind of surface as important nodes in the history of queer desire and queer affiliation, but they also seem just as quickly to sink back into obscurity again. And there seems to be something really important about something that is teaching us about the history of sexuality, something about his history of reception, about that kind of liminal space between affiliation and identification, and then a kind of to go back to the Carlos poem, like being kind of like pulled back into the ocean through that cycle of the tides, you know. So just interested to know if you have any thoughts along those lines.
Nothing specific. I think the phenomenon, you've like laid that out really well, and I think Nat Hurley's book is pretty fantastic, and I would recommend everybody who's interested in this to read it. But I think, you know, what I would say, what I was sitting here doing, trying to you know, prepare a lecture on the most famous gay poet you've never heard of, was I hedged a little bit, but it seems to me that the doubleness, the codedness, the sense that he was both, you know, a poet of legitimacy and taste for New York, and also maybe this kind of queer figure, and maybe the people around him were kind of in on that so much that they like cast him in bronze in a swishy way. That doubleness seemed important. Like, one wasn't the truth of the story. One wasn't like hiding the other, right? Like there was both things needed to be true. And that was actually what the story was the simultaneity or the double lifeness. We always use the term double life to mean something bad, like someone's, you know, overextending themselves, and, you know, and it's taxing, and double lives often are in that way. But I think he's a figure who has double meanings associated with him, more than one. You know, he's read by Abraham Lincoln, but he's also read by other people. So anyway, I'm not sure that answers the question, but it's just to say that I think it's an element of the history of sexuality. And I would also, John Birdsall's biography of, oh my gosh, James Beard, the chef, is a really interesting history of sexuality that tries to do this thing where it says, here's a guy who's living in Greenwich Village, but is older, significantly a generation older than the gay liberation that's going on around him. So how does he relate to a different generation's openness? And I thought about it. It's a really fantastic biography, but I thought about that a lot as I was kind of bringing this talk on Halleck, in that moment where, you know, it's like he's almost 30 years older than Whitman, 29 years older. Whitman is part of a generation who we have some documentation on the world he lived in. Do we just not have the documentation for Halleck's generation, or did he, in certain ways, was he just kind of like born too soon? And his relationship to desire and queerness just looked different than something that was a little bit more accessible and explicit 30 years later. I just don't know the answer to that. I haven't done enough, I haven't figured enough out. But anyway, that's a question I'd want to keep open.
This next question actually builds on what you were just talking about. So this is from Colin Johnson. Says, very interesting talk, Jordan. Thank you. In some ways, you're wrestling here with a problem anyone trying to talk about queer sexual alterity prior to about 1860 struggles with. How would you feel about renaming this talk Fitz-Greene Halleck, the gay enough poet, ? Because it seems to me that that notion, the notion of being gay enough, has a role to play in your own efforts to place Halleck for contemporary cultural, conceptual, political purposes.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty fantastic. I've been learning things from Colin Johnson for 20 years, and I'm happy to learn more tonight. I think that's exactly right. The gay enough poet. I think that is I think what the talk ended up being, or what I ended up kind of wrestling with. There's a way in which, like, you know, you read some of the poems, and there's more poems, but like just the two that I read tonight, like you read them and you're like, oh, like I think he's a gay enough poet, right? Like it seems there's not a question whether these are poems about one man's desire for another man. Like that seems like absolutely on the surface. The question is, like, you know, what do we make of that desire? What kind of world does it plug into? And that's a harder thing to know. But you know, the desire to reconstruct such a world is certainly, you know, one we have here in the 21st century, because we have gay history and we want there to be gay history, but we go back to find gay history, and what we find are things that are actually histories that are kind of different than the one we're living in. So I think gay enough is a pretty fantastic way to capture that in a phrase. So thank you, Colin.
Connie asks, she says, the librarian in me wants to know where you saw the issues of the whip, and noticed it would be something we would shelve as oversized. It's not small format.
Redex has a database of, like, I forget what it's called, but it's like Salacious New York or Salacious Gotham or something, but it's they have all the issues digitized now. And that's where there was a University of Chicago Press put together a book that transcribes selections, and that was where I first encountered it. That book's from like 10 years ago. But the primary texts are now actually really easily available. I love going to libraries, and I miss a reading room when I can be, but COVID has really made me aware of what is online, because I have had to do so much archival research, like in my living room. So anyway.
We have another question from anonymous attendee, is what it says. I thought your analysis of the elegy to Drake was wonderful, but weren't there some pretty obvious images, such as waking up and then holding hands? Mm-hmm. I don't have the poem in front of me, so I can't get more specific.
Yes, there are. And there is a sense in that poem. It's in the offing, it's not stated, but it seems like there's some competition with the woman who Drake married, right? Some sense of like, I should be the person who grieves you the most. I should be the person who mourns you. And you know, it's hard to know whether that, I wake up in order to clasp your hand, whether that's literal or you know, meant to be more like metonymic. I don't know. But yes, I think the degree of desire, the desire for contact, and it is interesting in both the poems I read, there's a sensuousness that is described. There's a touch that is present in the sense of contact, and it's often touching hands, but you know, who knows what that leads to. So I didn't mean to underplay that. I think I absolutely agree that it's there.
I have another question related to a paper I recently heard Ben Friedlander give at C19 last year, which was wonderful. And it was on Halleck, and it was called The Dandy's Descent. Mm-hmm. And Ben had this great, he's interested in this question of why Halleck, who was so famous in his day, as you showed us so beautifully, there were so many things I had not encountered before. but he's interested in why someone of that celebrity
Mhm.
could fall into obscurity so swiftly. One of his arguments is that, taste is so important to why Halleck becomes a beloved poet. He's a taste maker. Ben called this like his world building instincts in poetry to like actually help make everything feel that much more cohesive and familiar. And so then his argument is that it's for a poet who actually plays such a profound role in building something like the New York arts scene, like that actually becomes less and less familiar, more and more alienating to readers who come at it from a distance, right? And so it's actually like the very thing that makes him so popular is also the very thing that makes readers now feel often like unmoored or not sure, where to get their footing when they're coming across all of these allusions and name droppings, et cetera, that don't feel as ready to them, readily available.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. I think that's a bit kind of more smart and more elaborate than I think I would have come up with on my own. Halleck's poem, the croaker, right, is which is where he gets to start. Like, this is popular culture. This is talking to the moment. And the thing about popular culture is that it makes sense in context. We think that literature is formal, and it is. Poetry is highly formal, especially the kind that Halleck writes. But its significance, its legibility, its popularity is keyed to things that are extra-diegetic, that are outside the poetry itself, right? It has to be. And so, I think that taste-making element, why do we pay attention to Jonathan Franzen? Why are the people who are popular? It's merit is part of it, but it's not the whole story, right? There are feedback loops that structure these things. So, I think that makes a lot of sense. A lot of 19th century poets fall out for reasons that I don't totally understand. Poetry itself becomes a bit of an understudied subject in the second half, even among academics. American poetry of the 19th century becomes understudied in the second half of the 20th century. Whitman and Dickinson are important, but others not so much. Even someone like Irving becomes less noticed. Longfellow, these people sort of disappear, or they are the things that school children are expected to memorize, and they don't have a lot of other functions. That's changing because we're trying, I think now the scholarly field is trying to get a more thorough, more composite, more complete picture of, and we're interested in questions not just of like the literary merits, but also again, the world making that's happening around it. So yes, I think these things are changing for the better. I should also, I think Ben Friedlander's here, hi, but I should also say he's the one who led me to the Emily Dickinson letter. I hadn't known about that, so thank you.
I'm watching the box for more questions because I want to feature anyone who has one. I should say at the very beginning, this isn't a question, but Richard Candy says, "Bravo, well argued."
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I've been thinking about these things a lot. It was just so rewarding to get to talk about this. So I do have another question if no one else does. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is Halleck's hearing loss. So he loses his hearing in his left ear as a toddler when he's 2 years old. And then his hearing continues to diminish. And he talks about this in his letters, and the James Wilson biography that you mentioned provides some really interesting anecdotes that provide insight into this aspect of his life. It talks about how in church, if the sermon was too silent, he would inaudibly recite poems or favorite scriptures to himself, and talks about how he had these ways of responding to things that he felt were inaccessible to him at that level. And I've been interested in how this comes through in his verse. I think one thing that, and I'm interested to know if you have thoughts about this, that interests me, is that I do think he relies a lot on visuality and tactility in terms of the sensory stimuli that most interest him. That definitely comes through in the Carlos poem, where it's about, I gaze on your pleasing form, and then also thinking about, my breast, the throb repeats. And I'm interested to know if you have thoughts about this, I think it's really important to the way he expresses his desire for Carlos and for Joseph Rodman Drake. Not just expressing his love for them in terms of tactility and visuality, but also wanting to impart that understanding of their bodies to them through his poetry. And that's like part of his expression of desire. So any thoughts you have on that?
I think that's great. I think that's really yes, a world of yes. It is to imagine that the highly sensual, highly tactile imagery of some of these poems is also representing not just images for a reader, but or coded language for an audience, but expressions of Halleck's own sensory experience, in part due to limited sensory experience, right? Hearing loss. Like that's a really interesting and kind of, I think, deeper, more subtle way to think about it. I like that a lot. I also, the idea that the hearing impaired lover would reflect back to you something of his own experience, right, which is not identical to yours. Like that seems like the kinds of things lovers sometimes do, and it's a keep going with that. I think that's fantastic.
We have another question from Ben Bascom. Ben says, "What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Jordan. I love your reading of the statue at the end of the avowed swishy gay poet. Swishy is such a lovely word that does so much for thinking queerly about gender. It describes the sound of something moving through the air in the 1820s and comes to signify effeminate homosexual in quotes in the 1930s in the dictionary by my side. I guess I don't have a direct question, but more of an exclamation for more swishy. Would love to hear you think about that as a queer sound and queer aesthetic."
Well, I think, Don James, that jives a lot with what you were just saying about Halleck's sensory experience and his hearing impairedness. The book that I mentioned at the beginning, John Halleck with an O, John Halleck's American Byron, which is this kind of critical biography of Halleck. It's a really good study for a number of reasons. He's very determined to show us that Halleck was gay, and I respect what he's doing, and it's not what I'm doing, but it's I like gay histories that are just trying to cut through it and tell you like the burden of proof is not on queers, it's on this is so obvious. So I like what it's doing. It does spend some time talking about the different ways in which Halleck was regarded at different moments in his life by different people as effeminate. I shied away from talking about this because I think it's a really hard thing to talk about, because to say that a man in some ways is effeminate or is behaving like a woman, what it means to behave like a woman, I think we would all agree that like to be a woman in 1820 is different than to be a woman in 2020. And right, and so like, and these things aren't like absolutely different, but they're somewhat different. And so the traits that get attributed can be hard to track in any kind of objective way. Also, what seems to one person as effeminate may not seem to another person as effeminate. The reason I think I was able to talk about this with the statue, and people seem, Ben seemed to like it, people seem to like it, that's nice, is just that like, what bronze statue is cross-legged? Like, it's such a weird pose. And on the one hand, it's, you get, poets are often represented with books or seated in chairs, but that particular pose it just seemed, it's not that it's effeminate, it's just that it's a bit strange. And it seemed that maybe its strangeness was trying to say something. And it was for that reason that I kind of honed in on it. But I don't know that swishy is my word, and I'm not sure it's totally the right word. But again, because bronze sculptures are so, the artistry of them is about kind of trying to capture movement. I was interested in what is the movement that's being captured in that gesture. I don't know if leg crossing is a trans-historical signifier, but I'm not sure it's always effeminate, but it's something, and its unusualness again is what I'm comfortable talking about. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it is the answer I have.
Are there any other writers from this period who you think have an analogous relationship to gender and sexuality that Halleck has? I was thinking about Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake as contemporaries who feel much more explicitly queer in ways that resonate with, I think, a contemporary sensibility. But yeah, just interested to know if there's anyone else in this period who you think helps shed light on ways that we can read Halleck.
Nothing that I know well enough to say something about, but what I can say is that the story that we tell about gay history is a story of, like, we move from repression to liberation, and that's a good story. I like that story. I think a lot of people like that story, but for someone in Halleck's period, again, there seems to be a certain amount of tolerance or ignorance, but those things are sometimes related, benign neglect that is being bestowed on what I called emergent queer subcultures in the antebellum period in New York City. And again, it's not that people aren't trying to regulate sex, because they are, but they're particularly interested in regulating women's access to sex and women's ability to sell sex, and that's where regulation falls. It's actually a lot about gender policing, and sexuality becomes a way of gender policing. There's a lot of benign neglect of emergent queer subcultures, both male and female, but that means that people are just, that famous Lily Tomlin line where she says, in the 50s, nobody was gay, you were just shy. But something like that seems to be part of what's a sense of eccentricity. But and again, there are these, things start to emerge, especially in the 1830s, 40s, and as century moves on, and Fafs is a good example. But Halleck is like aged out a little bit at that point, which doesn't stop him from showing up there, but it's not his place the way it was Whitman's. So I guess I'm just reprising things that I was saying, but I think it's hard to, like, what it would mean to be like Halleck in this period is, I think, is something that's hard for me to kind of put my finger on, because I don't have a sense of, like, and I think maybe other people who may have felt the things that Halleck may have felt, it's kind of same-sex longings or yearnings or artistic expressions. I don't know that they necessarily had a bar to go to. I don't know that there was a public culture that was reflecting them back to themselves. The other reason that we get more after 1830, and you probably know this, but maybe not everyone in the audience does, the reason we get more after 1830 is because print expands enormously. There's more things that get printed, more newspapers, the costs go down and production technology improves. So there's historians have called this the antebellum print explosion, 1830 and after. But as a result, necessarily, we just have more written records of more kinds of things. So it makes the needle in the haystack game a little bit easier than it is for the period before. But anyway, I would be interested, excited even, to kind of figure out how to plot Halleck into a circuit of others, but I'm, again, not 100% sure who they would be or how they would have found each other.
Colin has one more question.
Yes, please.
Other than the 1980s New York Times piece you noted, have you found any innuendo in late 19th century posthumous discussions of Halleck's work? I ask because Anthony Rotundo argues that these kinds of passionate attachments were actually fairly common among young men of a certain class during the 19th century, but that they became very suspect after 1869 when Carl Maria Kurtbenny first named homosexuality as such.
Mm.
That shift could perhaps be navigated successfully by the unpublished personage, but it seems to me that it would have been much harder to navigate for the published author.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Halleck, the end of his life is a little bit murky to me. He leaves New York. He dies in Guilford, Connecticut, where he was born, and he has a sister who's like a lifelong correspondent who he kind of goes back and connects with in Guilford. He seems to have had a reputation for someone who liked to drink. Like he was to be found at bars. Um, John Halleck, the biographer, interprets this as alcoholism, which may be right. But anyway, so I don't. There certainly was a loneliness that seems to have characterized him, or that's what Halleck brings out. Halleck, the biographer, brings forward about Halleck, the poet. But it seems to me that may be something there. But anyway, but by the 1860s, like he may like questions of an active sex life or a public life like may have been a little off the table. He may have again like been born too late for that. But this is just to say that it's possible that like a relationship like the one that Halleck as a young man had with Joseph Rodman Drake was just the kind of friendship that young men had, but it seemed that Halleck wanted more out of it than Drake wanted to give him. And I have to imagine that such relationships sometimes happen if young men, if it was socially normative to engage in passionate relationships, sometimes those might have included sex, sometimes they might not have. Sometimes one person might have really wanted it to include sex and the other one didn't. Right? So I think there may be, I would agree with the interpretation that says these things are fairly common. On the ground, I think there's a certain amount of differentiation and different experience of them. And I would, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. I'm kind of insisting on, no, but the singular example like makes the pattern hard to locate. It's what I keep answering all the questions by saying. And I'm not sure I think that methodologically all the time. But in this case, maybe just I've been spending so much time thinking about this one man. But in this case, I think that there is some something that doesn't completely conform to other kinds of patterns. And it seemed like Halleck sought distinction, but he also seems to at moments have really rooted. So but a lot of that's true of a lot of famous people. So.
Jody Schwarb has another question. Hi, Jordan. I love playful recasting of his double life as literary figurehead and swishy bronze, and the recasting of his literary life alongside emerging queer spatial urban subcultures. James Gifford, whom you mentioned, directs us to the Bible, especially David and Jonathan, as a model to express male, love, touch, grief. So scholars have pointed us to literary antecedents picked up very consistently by Gay Enough writers down the generation. But your work is pushing the playful, knowing, and available spaces for seeing emerging queer subcultural awareness. Want to share any further thoughts on your archive of urban geography and your own reading process?
Mm-hmm. I can try. Look, if you ask me, was he gay? What do you think? Like, yeah, I think he was. But I also think that as a responsible scholar and historian, like, I can't prove that. Like, I don't know how to prove that. And was he gay in the ways that like I am or somebody else is? Like, I don't know. I think those things get complicated fast, and that was part of how I answered Colin's question and Ben's question and some others. But what I will say is that there are some really good books on these kinds of emergent sexual cultures of New York City in the antebellum period. Donna Dennis's book called Licentious Gotham, I really love, partially because it's a print culture history. Tim Guilfoyle's City of Eros, but there's others. A lot of the archive for this, again, is like, where were things raided? Where were there legal cases? Where were print shops or bars busted up, prostitution rings exposed? Because that's what we have records of. And it seems to me that what percentage of such crimes would get exposed? Like 10? Like if the vice rate is really active, like 25? I mean, let's say 50. That still means there's 50% of things we don't have records of. So I think I don't have like hard historical evidence, but I do have an imagination here, and I think here's what we know, but that doesn't mean it's representative. There has to be more. If, for example, vice squads in the late 1860s, as Colin points out, in the 1870s, start kind of identifying and picking up male prostitutes in the Bowery, those prostitutes didn't start there the minute they were arrested, right? Like they had been there for some time. And the question is, well, were they there for like 5 years, 10 years? Was this a post-Civil War phenomenon? Is it an antebellum phenomenon? Like, does it go back, to the 1820s? Like, I don't know. And I think such things are quite hard to document. But I think we have to assume that something was going on. And anyway, it's needles in haystacks that prove these kinds of things, or kind of the shreds of circumstantial evidence that begin to have proof. But it seems to me that like we have to insist that the historical record is incomplete because it so obviously is. And so concepts like tolerance or benign neglect just become ways of kind of catching the things that fall out of the historical record because they weren't being regulated, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. And someone like Halleck, who I think kind of stands out as a weirdo or maybe a queerdo, does so because of the ways he sort of, it's really hard to make him legible as a queer person, but he also seems to have been in certain ways trying to be legible. So that lack of fit becomes interesting to me because it points to some of the things we don't know, but that doesn't, they may not have been there, but they also may have. And so that's the game I'm playing. I don't know if that answers the question. It's more methodological, but it's something that that I think a lot about and that I'm trying to understand better. So anyway, thank you for the question, Jody.
To close, something I've been thinking about in relationship to the poem to Carlos again, as I've been working on it, is the way he's talking to Carlos about what he does to remember Carlos's presence and to kind of like fantasize that it's with him again. And he kind of sounds like a queer historian when he's talking about this stuff. So, two of the stanzas read, "Time whose destroying, wasting hand bears all before its sway, as marks imprinted on the sand the ocean sweeps away. Yet hath its circuit ruled in vain, your memory to efface. Still every feature I retain and every gesture trace." So I agree with you that he already kind of is imagining that his own memory will be persistently recovered in a similar way.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Jordan. And if you haven't already, please support the Charlotte Cushman Society. I'm going to put it in the chat. This is what makes it possible for us to have incredible lectures like this annually. So thank you everybody for coming. And I hope that we see this published at some point in the near future, Jordan.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And thanks to the audience for all your questions. I really appreciate them.
Bye, everyone.